The land broker who sold me this property looked me in the eye before we signed and said, "I have to be honest with you. I've been selling land in Presidio County for 23 years, and I have never seen anyone successfully farm this specific piece. The soil is wrong, the water situation is complicated, the heat will destroy most crops before they have a chance." I signed anyway, and 3 years later, I brought him back to walk the property. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said I was wrong. Presidio County sits in the far southwestern corner of Texas, in a region so remote and so extreme that most Americans have never heard of it and fewer have visited. The county seat, Presidio, sits on the Rio Grande, across from the Mexican city of Ojinaga, at an elevation of about 2,600 feet, in a basin surrounded by mountains that rise to over a mile above sea level. The climate in the basin is brutal. Summer temperatures regularly exceed 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The annual rainfall averages less than 10 inches, and the wind blows with the particular relentlessness of a landscape that has nothing to slow it down for hundreds of miles in any direction. But drive north and east from Presidio, up into the higher terrain of the county's interior, and the elevation climbs toward 4,500 and 5,000 feet. Up there, the heat is still fierce in summer, but not lethal. The nights cool dramatically. 30-degree temperature swings between afternoon and midnight are common. The rainfall ticks up slightly. The soil changes character. And the light at that elevation in far west Texas, is something that photographers and filmmakers have been coming to this region to capture for decades. It has a quality that doesn't exist at lower elevations, a clarity and depth of color that comes from the altitude, the aridity, and the particular mineral composition of the air above the Chihuahuan Desert. The 28 acres I purchased sat at 4,200 feet, elevation in the high terrain north of Presidio. The access road was a dirt track off a county road that itself was unpaved for the last 6 miles. The nearest town of any size was an hour away. The nearest hardware store was 90 minutes. What the 28 acres had: rocky, caliche-heavy soil with scattered native desert vegetation. Creosote, lechuguilla, desert willow, and the occasional prickly pear cactus that had found a foothold in the rocky terrain. No structures, no water, infrastructure, a faint seasonal drainage channel that ran briefly after summer monsoon rains and was dry the rest of the year. What the 28 acres didn't have, anything that a conventional assessment would call agricultural potential. My nearest neighbor, a rancher named Hector, who had run cattle on the surrounding terrain for 35 years, came over on my second day on the property. He was a large, quiet man who communicated primarily in short sentences and long silences, which I came to understand as a far west Texas communication style rather than unfriendliness. He looked at the rocky terrain. He looked at the dry drainage channel. He looked at the sparse desert vegetation. "Caliche," he said, pointing at the white hardpan visible wherever the thin, rocky surface soil was disturbed. "Yes, sir," I said. Another long pause. "Rio Grande's down there," he said, gesturing south toward the invisible river miles away. "I know," I said. "Water rights are complicated in Texas," he said. "I have water rights," I said. I had spent 3 months before closing verifying this specifically. The property carried a small but legally established water right from a groundwater conservation district permit that a previous owner had obtained decades ago and never used. Hector looked at me. "You're going to try to farm this," he said. Not a question. "Yes, sir." The longest pause yet. "Nobody's farmed this specific ground in my memory," he said. "Maybe ever." "I know," I said. He nodded once, got in his truck and drove away. The soil of far west Texas at 4,200 feet elevation is not a simple material. It looks inhospitable, rocky, pale, seemingly inert. but its complexity runs deeper than its surface suggests. The dominant soil type on my property was a Torreothent, a desert soil formed on steep, rocky terrain where erosion has prevented significant soil profile development. Shallow over bedrock in many areas, rarely more than 12 to 18 inches deep before, hitting either calichy hardpan or fractured limestone bedrock. The organic matter content was essentially unmeasurable, less than 0.3%. The pH was high, 8.4 in most areas. The texture was loamy sandy in the surface layer, transitioning to calichy at depth, but the mineral content was extraordinary. West Texas soils developed on limestone and volcanic parent material carried trace mineral concentrations that most agricultural soils have long since lost to decades of intensive cropping. Calcium, magnesium, iron, manganese, zinc, copper. The Chihuahuan desert soil is a mineral treasury locked behind its alkalinity and its lack of organic matter and water. The key insight, the one that made everything possible, was that these soils didn't need to be replaced or overwhelmed with amendments. They needed to be unlocked. The mineral wealth was already there. What was missing was the biology to access it, the organic matter to hold moisture and nutrients, and the water to make the whole system function. The University of Texas at El Paso Agricultural Extension had published research on dryland farming in the Trans-Pecos region that I had studied carefully before purchasing the property. Their work showed that Chihuahuan desert soils, when properly amended and irrigated, could produce yields that surprised researchers who had expected minimal results. The soil wanted to produce. It just needed conditions it had never been given. I was going to give it those conditions. The water rights I had inherited with the property were from a groundwater conservation district permit, the right to pump from the local aquifer for agricultural use. The permit specified a volume limit that was more than adequate for the drip-irrigated production operation I was planning, but would have been insufficient for flood irrigation or overhead sprinklers. Drip was the only water-efficient option in this climate regardless, so the permit limit was not a practical constraint. The driller I hired came from Alpine, a man named Ruben who had been drilling wells in the Trans-Pecos region for 20 years and knew the aquifer geology of Presidio County better than any map. He surveyed the property with geophysical equipment and identified the best drilling location, not where I had assumed, but at the base of a slight rise on the eastern edge of the property, where he said the fractured limestone was most likely to carry water. He was right. At 285 feet, the drill hit a producing zone. The flow rate was modest, 1.5 gallons per minute, but consistent and, crucially, year-round. In a region that received less than 12 inches of annual rainfall, a well producing 1.5 gallons per minute was the difference between a farm and a desert. The water came up cold and clear and slightly mineralized, the taste of limestone aquifer water that is distinctive and, once you've tasted it, unmistakable. I held my hands under the first flow from the pipe and thought about the people who had looked at this property over the years and seen nothing of value. They hadn't drilled. Before I could plant anything meaningful, I had to build soil where the existing material was too shallow, too alkaline, and too biologically dead to support crops. I chose a different approach than I had used on previous projects. The depth limitation, bedrock or caliche at 12 to 18 inches in most areas, meant that in-ground beds were constrained in ways that raised beds were not. But I didn't want the visual and infrastructure overhead of a full raised bed system across 28 acres. Instead, I used a hybrid approach. Deep amended ground beds in the areas where the soil profile was deepest, and raised beds with locally sourced materials in the rocky sections where the soil profile was shallowest. For the ground beds in the deeper soil areas, I used a yeoman's plough, a keyline subsoiler that runs a single deep shank through the soil at an angle. that follows the land's natural contour, opening deep channels for water infiltration and root penetration without inverting the soil profile. 3 passes at different depths, 12, 16 and 20 inches, opened the soil to a depth that would have been impossible with conventional tillage on this rocky terrain. Into the open channels, I injected a liquid organic amendment, a blend of fish emulsion, kelp and beneficial microbial inoculant that went directly to the fractured zones. In the soil profile, where roots would eventually travel, this was not topsoil amendment. This was subsoil biology introduction, creating the biological conditions at depth that would allow roots to penetrate the hard Chihuahuan desert subsoil rather than being stopped by it. On the surface, I added 6 inches of composted material, a mix of local mesquite wood chips, aged goat manure from a ranch 30 miles away, and elemental sulfur to begin addressing the alkalinity. The desert soil, opened at depth and covered with organic matter at the surface, began its transformation. It would take time. Desert soil transformation always takes time. But time was something I had built into my plan from the beginning. The first season was not for crops, it was for soil. Building in far west Texas at 4,200 feet elevation requires respect for 2 different enemies: heat and wind. The summer heat is extreme. Surface temperatures on unshaded ground can exceed 150 degrees Fahrenheit in July. But the wind is, in some ways, the more constant challenge, a persistent desiccating wind that removes moisture from soil surfaces, from plant leaves, and from anything left unprotected faster than the low annual rainfall can replace it. I designed the main barn to address both. Thick adobe-style walls, constructed from stabilized earth blocks, made with the site's own soil mixed with a small amount of cement, provided thermal mass that kept the interior temperature stable despite the external extremes. The walls stored heat during the day and released it slowly at night, moderating the 30-degree temperature swings that would otherwise stress any temperature-sensitive crops or equipment stored inside. The roof was a combination of metal for durability and a layer of spray foam insulation beneath the metal for heat control. A roof monitor, a raised section running the length of the building with ventilation gaps, allowed hot air to escape from the peak while drawing cooler air from the shaded north wall openings below. The result was a barn that was 20 degrees cooler than the outside air in July without any mechanical cooling, a significant achievement in a climate where air conditioning is normally assumed to be non-negotiable. A shade structure, a simple steel frame covered with 60% shade cloth, went up over the most vulnerable section of the production zone before the first summer. Far West Texas sun at 4,200 feet is not the same as sun at sea level. The UV intensity and the direct radiation at this elevation can damage crops that would handle full sun perfectly well at lower elevations. The shade cloth reduced the effective light intensity to something more manageable while still providing the long day length that the elevation offers. Windbreaks came last. Not trees this time, because trees at this elevation and rainfall would require more irrigation infrastructure than I could justify, but a series of brush fence panels constructed from harvested desert willow and creosote branches woven between installed posts, traditional vernacular wind protection that far west Texas ranchers have used for generations. Cheap, effective, replenished annually from material that the desert produces in abundance. The agricultural heritage of the Trans-Pecos region is older than the United States. The Jumano people farmed the Rio Grande floodplain here for centuries before European contact, growing corn, beans and squash in the same desert river environment that I was now working with in a different form. The Spanish missionaries who established the Presidio del Norte in the 17th century created irrigated gardens that surprised later travelers with their productivity in what appeared to be an inhospitable environment. The land had fed people before. It had just been a long time since anyone had tried. I chose crops based on 3 criteria: adaptation to the specific combination of intense heat, cool nights, and low humidity that characterizes the far West Texas high-elevation climate, economic value that justified the infrastructure investment, and cultural connection to the region's agricultural history. Cantaloupes came first. Presidio County has a documented history of cantaloupe production going back generations. The combination of intense heat, cool nights, alkaline soil, and dry air produces a sugar concentration in the fruit that flat, humid growing environments cannot replicate. The melons grown in this region have a reputation among chefs in Texas and beyond. I planted a significant section of Hale's Best and Honey Rock varieties, both heritage cantaloupe varieties adapted to arid southwest conditions. Chili peppers, because no agricultural story in far west Texas is complete without chili. I planted a section of Hatch-style New Mexico chili alongside a traditional Presidio pepper variety that a seed-saving organization had preserved from the region's historical agricultural tradition. Growing the Presidio pepper variety on Presidio County soil felt like a kind of homecoming for both the seed and the land. Desert herbs, culinary and medicinal plants native to or adapted for the Chihuahuan desert environment. Epazote, the pungent herb used throughout Mexican and southwestern cuisine. Mexican oregano, different from Mediterranean oregano and specifically adapted to hot, dry conditions. And desert sage, used both culinarily and medicinally throughout the region. And cotton. Yes, cotton. West Texas is cotton country at lower elevations, and the high elevation, short season conditions I was working with were not ideal for conventional cotton production. But an heirloom variety called Acala, developed specifically for West Texas conditions, was adapted to exactly the elevation range and temperature swing pattern of my property. I planted a small demonstration section, not for commercial production, but for the profound agricultural statement that growing cotton on land that nobody believed could feed anyone makes in far west Texas. The first summer in far west Texas was something I had prepared for intellectually and had not fully prepared for physically. The heat arrived in June and did not leave until October. Not the 110-degree basin heat of Presidio itself, the elevation moderated that, but sustained temperatures above 95 degrees Fahrenheit for weeks at a time, with surface soil temperatures that exceeded 130 degrees in unshaded areas. The cow, drip irrigation ran twice daily, early morning and late afternoon, putting water precisely at the root zone where it could be absorbed before the surface heat evaporated it. The wind was what I had underestimated. The brushwood windbreaks helped at close range, but the open terrain beyond the production zone channeled wind events that reached the farm at speeds that stripped mulch, bent young plants, and required constant maintenance attention. I doubled the windbreak density after the first significant wind event in July and accepted that wind management in far west Texas would be an ongoing operational cost rather than a one-time infrastructure investment. The cantaloupes responded to the heat in the way that I had hoped but not entirely expected. The vines grew aggressively in the drip-irrigated shaded beds, their roots going deep into the yeoman's plow-open soil profile. By late July, the first melons were sizing, and the sugar development, visible in the skin netting pattern, and verifiable by refractometer reading, was ahead of schedule. The 30-degree temperature swing between afternoon and midnight was doing exactly what I had read it would do, concentrating sugars in the fruit at a rate that flat, warm night growing environments cannot achieve. Hector drove by in early August and stopped at my gate, which he had not done since the first week. He got out of his truck and looked at the cantaloupe section from the road. "Those melons?" he said. "Yes, sir," said. He looked at them for a long moment. "Hale's Best?" he said. He knew his cantaloupe varieties. This was far west Texas, after all. "Hale's Best and Honey Rock," I said. Another long pause in the far west Texas style. "My grandmother grew Hale's Best," he said, "on the Rio Grande, long time ago." He got back in his truck and drove away without further comment, but he had stopped. That was something. The first cantaloupe harvest came in late August, after a growing season that had tested every system I had built. I picked the first ripe melon early in the morning before the heat arrived, when the fruit was still cool from the night. The slip, the point where the melon detaches cleanly from the vine when it is perfectly ripe, came with a satisfying release that told me everything I needed to know about the sugar development before I cut it open. The flesh was deep orange, dense, and so fragrant that I could smell it before I cut it. The refractometer read 14 bricks, sugar, content that placed it in the premium category for cantaloupe and explained why Presidio County melons had historically commanded prices above standard commercial production. I sat in the early morning light in far west Texas at 4,200 feet elevation on land that a 23-year veteran land broker had told me could not be farmed, and I ate a cantaloupe that this land had made from almost nothing. It was the best cantaloupe I have ever eaten. The chili harvest followed in September. The New Mexico-style peppers heavy on the plants, the Presidio Heritage variety, smaller but intensely flavored. The desert herbs had established and were being cut regularly for bundled fresh herb sales. The Aquila cotton had produced bolls, not a commercial yield, but real bolls on real cotton plants on land that nobody had farmed in living memory. A chef in Marfa, the small art community 60 miles to the northeast that had become one of the most food-forward small towns in Texas, heard about the Presidio Heritage chili variety from a seed-saving contact and reached out about a direct purchase. She drove to the farm and walked through the chili section herself, asking questions about the soil, the water, the growing methods, the variety's history. She bought everything I had. She put it on her menu as Presidio County Heritage Chili, and her customers asked about it specifically. Year 2 brought a drought that Hector described as the worst in 15 years. The summer monsoon, which normally provided a modest but meaningful supplemental moisture to the region's agricultural operations, arrived 6 weeks late and delivered less than half its typical volume. The aquifer, which Ruben had told me was reliable year-round, did not fail. But the flow rate dropped measurably during the drought's peak, and I found myself calculating water budget with a precision I hadn't needed in year 1. I reduced the production area under active irrigation by 30%, prioritizing the cantaloupes, which were the highest value crop, and the chili section, which had established well and could handle more stress than the melons. The cotton section received minimal irrigation. I was curious whether the Aquila variety's drought adaptation would allow it to survive on reduced water. It did. Not productively. The boll set was reduced significantly, but the plants survived, which told me something about the variety's resilience that I filed away for future seasons. The herbs section handled the drought better than anything else on the farm. Desert-adapted culinary herbs are drought-adapted by nature. The stress of the dry year actually intensified the essential oil concentration in the Mexican oregano and epazote, producing a more potent product that the Marfa chef noticed immediately. "Your oregano this year," she said when I delivered the fall harvest. "What did you do differently?" "Nothing," I said. "The drought did it." She was quiet for a moment. "Then I hope it droughts again," she said. The drought also did something to the cantaloupe that I hadn't anticipated and that became one of the most valuable lessons of the entire project. The melons that survived the reduced irrigation, stressed, smaller than the previous year, tested at 17 bricks, 3 points higher than the first-year melons, which had been irrigated at normal rates. Controlled water stress in cantaloupe production is a known technique for increasing sugar concentration. I had read about it, but experiencing it firsthand, watching stressed plants produce smaller fruit with dramatically higher sugar content, turned academic knowledge into operational understanding. Year 3's irrigation management was redesigned around deliberate late-season stress to maximize bricks rather than fruit size. Something happened in Year 2 and 3 that I had not planned for and could not have anticipated. Word got out, not through any marketing effort on my part, not through social media, or a website or a press release, through the specific information channels of Far West Texas, which operate through truck stops and feed stores, and the particular density of connection that exists in communities where everyone knows everyone, and news travels the way it has always traveled in remote places, person to person, slowly at first, then all at once. People started coming to the farm. Not many. This is Far West Texas, not a suburban farmers market environment, but meaningful numbers. A retired rancher who had grown up in Presidio County brought his wife and 2 grandchildren and spent an afternoon walking the production zones and the soil test results I had posted in the barn. A high school agriculture teacher from Marfa brought her class to see what was possible in the region's terrain. A journalist from a Texas agriculture publication drove 4 hours to write a piece about farming at elevation in the Trans-Pecos. And Hector came, not casually this time. He called ahead, which in 35 years of ranching in Presidio County he had probably never done, and asked if he could bring someone. He brought his son, who was in his late 20s, and had been talking about leaving the county for work. They walked the entire property with me, all of it. The production zones, the soil amendment areas, the well, the barn, the windbreaks, the shade structure. Hector's son asked questions, specific, informed questions about water budget, about market channels, about what the land cost to operate per acre. At the end of the walk, Hector stopped at the cantaloupe section. He looked at the plants for a long time. "My grandmother's melons," he said. He had said this before, but this time it was different. This time he was looking at it happening again, on land near where his family had ranched for generations, on terrain that everyone had written off. His son said, "Dad, this is what we should be doing with the South 40. Hector was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, "Maybe." By year 3, the 28 acres of Far West Texas high desert that nobody had believed could feed anyone was feeding people, not thousands of people. This was not an industrial operation, and it was never meant to be, but real people, eating real food grown in real soil that had been considered too rocky and too dry and too alkaline and too remote and too extreme to produce anything. The cantaloupe section was at peak production. The year 3 irrigation management, designed around deliberate late-season stress, produced fruit averaging 15 bricks, with peaks hitting 18. The Marfa chef who had been buying the chili was now buying the cantaloupes as well, featuring them as a seasonal menu item with the specific provenance. Presidio County, Far West Texas, 40,200 feet elevation, that her clientele responded to with the particular enthusiasm of people who understand that place matters in food. The chili section was in its 3rd year of production, with the heritage Presidio variety now being grown from seed I had saved from the first harvest, the beginning of a seed-to-seed continuity that connected this production back to the agricultural history of the county in a way that felt significant and right. The desert herbs had established as a perennial system, the Mexican oregano and epazote, returning each year without replanting. The desert sage spreading slowly from its initial planting zone into the surrounding areas. A perennial income stream from plants that asked for almost nothing. The soil organic matter in the main production zones had climbed from its initial reading of less than 0.3% to 1.8%, not yet where I wanted it, but a six-fold increase in 3 years that the University of Texas El Paso extension agent who retested the soil called remarkable for this soil type and climate. And the land broker who had warned me before I signed, the 23-year veteran of Presidio County land sales who had told me the soil was wrong and the water was complicated and the heat would destroy my crops. I brought him back in October of year 3. He walked the cantaloupe section. He looked at the chili plants. He examined the herb beds. He stood in front of the adobe barn and looked at its construction. When we got back to the gate, he was quiet for a long time in the way that far west Texas people are quiet. Then he said, "I was wrong." 3 words. In far west Texas, that's a speech. Let me tell you what nobody believed about this piece of land. They didn't believe the soil could support crops. It can. The mineral wealth was always there, waiting for organic matter, biology and water to unlock it. They didn't believe the water situation was solvable. It was. 285 feet down, there was water that had been sitting under this land for decades, permitted and unused, waiting for someone willing to drill. They didn't believe the heat could be managed. It can. Shade, cloth, drip irrigation, timing of plantings, the same tools that farmers in similar climates around the world have used for centuries. They didn't believe the distance and remoteness made the economics work. They do. When you grow something in a place that nobody else grows it, with a flavor profile that only that specific combination of altitude, soil, and temperature can produce, the market comes to you. The chef drove 4 hours to the farm. She'll drive it again. Nobody believed this piece of land could feed anyone. I proved it could, not because I was smarter than the people who looked at this land before me, not because I had resources they didn't, because I asked different questions. Instead of asking, why can't this land produce food? I asked, what does this land need to produce food? And then I provided those things: water, soil biology, organic matter, wind protection, shade, the right crops for the specific conditions. The land did the rest. Hector's son is putting in a cantaloupe trial on his father's South 40 acres this spring. He called me to ask about the irrigation design. The land that couldn't feed anyone is teaching the county how to feed itself.